In the mid-2000s, Waco, Texas was a place where routine and faith blended seamlessly into everyday life. Church bells marked the rhythm of the week, neighbors recognized one another by name, and reputations were built slowly over time. In communities like this, trust was currency, and few men appeared more deserving of it than Matthew Dwayne Baker. Matt Baker was a dentist by profession and a youth pastor by calling. In public, he embodied responsibility and devotion. He worked with children at church, spoke about morality and discipline, and presented himself as a man guided by faith. Parents trusted him with their children. Patients trusted him with their health. Congregants trusted him with their spiritual well-being. To many, Matt Baker was the kind of man people hoped their sons would grow up to be. Stacey Baker believed that too. Stacey was a young mother, gentle in nature and deeply committed to her family. Friends described her as warm, trusting, and compassionate. She believed in love as an act of faith, in marriage as a sacred bond, and in forgiveness as a way of life. When she married Matt, those around her believed she had found stability, purpose, and protection. For a brief time, the marriage appeared ordinary. Then Stacey began to get sick. At first, the symptoms were easy to dismiss. Persistent fatigue, digestive problems, sudden weakness that seemed to come and go. Doctors ran tests, but nothing definitive emerged. The uncertainty was frustrating but not alarming. Many people suffer unexplained illnesses, especially under stress. Matt stepped in as her advocate. He attended medical appointments with her. He spoke confidently with doctors. He explained her symptoms in detail and kept careful records. As a healthcare professional himself, his involvement did not seem unusual. If anything, it appeared supportive. But as weeks turned into months, Stacey's condition worsened. Her energy drained, her independence faded. She began to rely almost entirely on Matt, not just physically but emotionally. Friends noticed she seemed anxious and withdrawn. She questioned her own body, unsure why she felt the way she did. At times, she expressed fear that something was seriously wrong, yet no one could tell her what it was. Matt reassured everyone. He told friends that Stacey had a complex medical condition. He framed her suffering as unfortunate but manageable. He positioned himself as the patient, devoted husband standing by his wife through illness. Behind closed doors, however, something far more sinister was unfolding. Stacey's symptoms were not random. They followed patterns. They intensified after meals. They flared when Matt was solely responsible for her care. At the time, no one connected these dots. The idea that a husband, a pastor, and a dentist could deliberately harm his wife was unthinkable. That assumption would prove fatal. By the summer of 2006, Stacey Baker was dead. When authorities were notified, Matt Baker appeared composed. He explained that Stacey had been sick for a long time. He framed her death as tragic but expected. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious injuries, no immediate reason to suspect foul play. To the outside world, it looked like a heartbreaking end to a difficult illness. But death has a way of exposing truth, even when truth has been carefully hidden. As investigators began to examine Stacey's medical history more closely, questions emerged. Her symptoms did not align neatly with any known disease. The rapid progression of her decline raised concerns. Medical professionals reviewing the case began to feel that something was wrong. Very wrong. What initially appeared to be a private tragedy was slowly transforming into a criminal investigation. The man everyone trusted was about to face scrutiny he never anticipated, and the quiet life he had constructed was on the brink of collapse. Stacey Baker's story was only just beginning to be told. In the days following Stacey Baker's death, sympathy poured in from every direction. Members of the church prayed for Matt. Friends dropped off food. Messages of condolence filled his phone. In public, he accepted comfort with quiet solemnity, presenting himself as a grieving widower left to raise children alone after a long and painful illness took his wife. But while the community mourned, investigators began asking questions. Stacey's death certificate did not immediately provide clarity. There was no definitive disease listed that could explain the severity and duration of her symptoms. Medical professionals reviewing her history struggled to identify a condition that would cause such a steady decline in a relatively young woman with no known terminal diagnosis. The uncertainty prompted a deeper look. Authorities requested Stacey's medical records stretching back months before her death. What they found was troubling. The complaints were frequent, the symptoms severe, but the test results were often normal or inconclusive. There were hospital visits that ended with more questions than answers, treatments that did little to help, and always, consistently, Matt Baker was present. Doctors noted that Matt often spoke for Stacey. He described her pain. He framed her symptoms. He guided conversations toward certain explanations while dismissing others. At the time, it appeared protective. In hindsight, it appeared controlling. Investigators also learned that Stacey had confided in a small circle of friends that she felt something was wrong, something beyond illness. She struggled to explain it, often questioning her own instincts. She trusted Matt, yet felt afraid of her body, afraid of the confusion, afraid that no one believed her. As the inquiry progressed, the manner of Stacey's death was reevaluated. Toxicology testing was ordered. The results raised red flags. Substances were detected that should not have been present in her system. While not immediately conclusive, the findings were enough to shift the investigation from natural causes to potential homicide. That shift changed everything. Detectives began examining Matt Baker not as a grieving husband, but as a possible suspect. They reviewed his background, his education, and his access to substances that could cause harm without leaving obvious traces. As a dentist, Matt had knowledge of chemicals and medications. He understood dosage, exposure, and the way certain toxins could mimic illness. More disturbing still was the discovery of Matt's digital footprint. Investigators uncovered internet searches conducted over an extended period, searches related to poisons, searches about symptoms that resembled Stacey's suffering, searches about substances that could be administered slowly and quietly. The pattern suggested planning, not panic. At the same time, detectives uncovered inconsistencies in Matt's statements. Small details shifted, timelines blurred, explanations felt rehearsed. What once sounded like the careful recollection of a grieving husband now resembled a script. Then came the discovery that shattered any remaining presumption of innocence. Matt Baker was living a double life. Hidden behind the image of a faithful husband and pastor was an extramarital relationship. Messages revealed emotional intimacy, frustration with his marriage, and discussions about a future that did not include Stacey. In those conversations, Stacey was not spoken of with compassion. She was described as a problem. Investigators began to see the full picture forming. Stacey's prolonged illness was not an unfortunate mystery. It was part of a larger design, a slow erosion of her strength, a weakening that would make her death seem inevitable rather than suspicious. What investigators now believed was chilling in its simplicity. Matt Baker did not want to leave his wife. He wanted to outlive her. As the case against him strengthened, the community that once embraced him began to recoil. The man they trusted was now being discussed in hushed tones. Parents questioned how well they truly knew him. Church members struggled to reconcile the preacher with the evidence. And for Stacey, whose voice had been quieted long before her death, the truth was finally beginning to speak. This was no longer a story about unexplained illness. It was becoming a story about calculated betrayal. As the investigation deepened, the image Matt Baker had spent years cultivating continued to collapse. Detectives no longer viewed his actions through the lens of grief or coincidence. Instead, they examined every choice, every message, and every decision as part of a deliberate pattern. What emerged was not a momentary lapse or a crime driven by emotion, but a sustained effort to control, manipulate, and ultimately remove the one person standing in the way of the life Matt wanted. The affair became a central focus. Through recovered emails, messages, and witness testimony, investigators reconstructed Matt's hidden relationship. The tone of those communications stood in stark contrast to the man who preached devotion and sacrifice. He complained about the limitations of marriage. He expressed frustration with Stacey's illness, not as a husband overwhelmed by concern, but as someone inconvenienced by her existence. He spoke about freedom, about starting over, about a future that felt impossible while Stacey was alive. What was most disturbing was the absence of empathy. In private, Stacey was reduced to a burden. Her suffering was not met with compassion but irritation. The illness that weakened her body became, in Matt's mind, an opportunity. An illness explained her decline. An illness justified her death. An illness shielded him from suspicion. Prosecutors would later argue that Matt Baker understood exactly what he was doing. He knew divorce would raise questions. It would threaten his reputation within the church and expose his infidelity. It would damage the image he relied on for authority and respect. Widowhood, however, would grant him sympathy. It would preserve his standing and free him from accountability. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a crime of image management. Investigators revisited Stacey's final months with this new understanding. They mapped her symptoms against Matt's access to her food, her drinks, and her medications. They examined moments when her condition worsened and matched them to periods when Matt was alone with her. The patterns became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Medical experts testified that the substances found in Stacey's system could produce exactly the kind of prolonged suffering she experienced: weakness, confusion, pain that ebbed and flowed, symptoms that mimicked natural illness while steadily damaging the body. This method ensured control, silence, and time. Time to prepare. Time to rehearse explanations. Time to ensure no one questioned him. Witnesses also described Matt's behavior during Stacey's decline as unsettling. He appeared calm while she suffered. He documented her symptoms with unusual precision. He spoke about her condition in clinical terms, detached from emotion. To outsiders, it seemed like coping. To investigators, it appeared calculated. Even Stacey herself sensed something was wrong. Friends recalled conversations where she expressed fear she could not explain. She questioned whether her illness made sense. She worried she was losing control of her own body, yet her faith and trust kept her from accusing the one person closest to her. She believed in marriage. She believed in prayer. And most of all, she believed in her husband. That belief cost her everything. As prosecutors assembled their case, they framed Matt Baker not as a man overwhelmed by temptation, but as someone who believed he was smarter than everyone else. A man who thought his education, his profession, and his religious authority placed him above suspicion. A man who assumed that trust, once earned, could be exploited indefinitely. The walls were closing in. Search histories, toxicology reports, witness testimony, and digital correspondence converged into a narrative that was difficult to refute. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion: Stacey Baker's suffering was not an accident of fate. It was the result of intent. When Matt Baker was formally charged, shock rippled through the community. The dentist, the pastor, the trusted figure, now a defendant facing accusations that would follow him for the rest of his life. For Stacey, justice was finally within reach. But the process would require revisiting every painful detail of her final months, exposing the depth of betrayal she endured. The trial ahead would not just determine Matt Baker's guilt or innocence. It would force an entire community to confront how easily evil can hide behind respectability. By the time the case against Matt Baker reached the courtroom, the story had already unsettled far beyond Waco, Texas. What began as a suspected natural death had transformed into a portrait of prolonged cruelty carried out behind a mask of faith and professionalism. For prosecutors, the challenge was not merely proving that Stacey Baker had been poisoned, but proving that the man responsible was the same man who stood in court claiming to love her. The courtroom was filled each day with observers struggling to reconcile two versions of the same person. On one side sat Matt Baker, composed and controlled, dressed conservatively, his posture calm. On the other side was the version of him described by evidence, methodical, deceptive, and calculating. The contrast was jarring, and it was deliberate. From the opening arguments, the prosecution made one thing clear. This was not a case built on speculation or emotion. It was a case built on time. Time measured in months of unexplained illness. Time marked by repeated exposure to substances that weakened Stacey's body. Time spent researching, planning, and preparing explanations long before death occurred. Jurors were taken through Stacey Baker's final months in painstaking detail. Medical experts testified about the symptoms she endured and explained how they aligned with chronic poisoning. They described how certain toxins, when administered gradually, can mimic illness, evade immediate detection, and erode the body from within. Stacey's weakness, confusion, and pain were no longer mysterious. They were predictable outcomes. The prosecution emphasized that this method required patience. It required proximity. And it required access. Matt Baker had all three. Witnesses described how Matt controlled Stacey's environment. He prepared meals. He managed her medications. He limited her interactions when she was most vulnerable. The jury heard how her condition often worsened when Matt was solely responsible for her care. Each account added another layer to the narrative of dominance and manipulation. Digital evidence played a critical role. Prosecutors presented records of Matt's internet searches, conducted over an extended period. The searches revealed an interest in toxic substances, their effects on the human body, and how symptoms could be mistaken for natural illness. These were not frantic searches made during a medical emergency. They were deliberate, repeated, and specific. The implication was unavoidable. Matt Baker was educating himself. The defense attempted to counter this by portraying Matt as a concerned husband seeking answers for his wife's unexplained illness. They argued that his medical background made such research reasonable, but prosecutors dismantled that explanation piece by piece. The timing of the searches, their content, and their persistence painted a picture not of concern, but of preparation. Then came testimony about the affair. Jurors listened as messages were read aloud, exposing the private thoughts Matt never intended anyone else to hear. In those words, Stacey was not a partner or a loved one. She was an obstacle, a problem delaying the life Matt wanted to live. The prosecution argued that these communications revealed motive, not sudden rage, but long-term dissatisfaction combined with fear of public exposure. Divorce would have cost Matt his image. Death preserved it. At least that was the plan. Former friends and church members took the stand, many visibly shaken. They spoke about the trust they placed in Matt Baker. They spoke about how he preached integrity, responsibility, and moral discipline. Some struggled to speak at all, grappling with guilt over having believed so completely in someone capable of such deception. Medical professionals testified that Stacey's symptoms did not align with any known disease progression. They explained how her decline lacked the markers typically associated with natural illness. One expert described her condition as consistent with repeated exposure to harmful substances administered in controlled amounts. The jury listened silently. Throughout the proceedings, Matt Baker showed little visible emotion. His composure was noted by observers and later referenced by the prosecution as another example of emotional detachment. While not evidence in itself, it reinforced the image of a man who believed control equaled safety. For Stacey Baker's family, each day in court was a reopening of wounds. They listened as her suffering was dissected clinically, stripped of intimacy, and reduced to evidence. Yet they remained, determined that her story be fully heard, even if it was painful. The prosecution closed this phase of the case with a powerful assertion. This was not a tragic accident. This was not a medical mystery. This was a deliberate act carried out slowly, quietly, and with intent. A murder designed to look like illness. As the trial moved forward, the defense prepared its response, knowing that the next phase would determine whether the jury accepted Matt Baker's version of events or the devastating truth presented before them. The outcome would not only decide his fate, it would define how Stacey Baker's life and death would be remembered. As the trial moved into its final phase, the defense faced an uphill battle. The volume of evidence presented against Matt Baker had reshaped the narrative from one of uncertainty to one of intent. Still, his legal team worked to reframe the story, attempting to reintroduce doubt where the prosecution had constructed clarity. The defense argued that Stacey Baker's death was the tragic result of an undiagnosed illness compounded by stress and medical complexity. They emphasized the lack of immediate, dramatic evidence often associated with homicide. There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, no single moment that definitively marked the act. They suggested that the prosecution was weaving unrelated details into a theory driven more by suspicion than proof. But this case was never about a single moment. It was about accumulation. Prosecutors reminded the jury that some crimes are not loud, some do not erupt in chaos, some unfold quietly in private spaces over long periods of time. This was one of those cases. Every symptom Stacey experienced, every unanswered question, every unexplained decline was another thread. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Expert witnesses returned to reinforce that pattern. Toxicologists explained how the substances found in Stacey's body would not necessarily cause immediate death, but would weaken her organs gradually. They described how such exposure could be masked by normal medical uncertainty, especially when filtered through a caregiver who controlled information. That caregiver, they argued, was Matt Baker. The prosecution highlighted how Matt consistently positioned himself between Stacey and outside help. He managed her appointments. He interpreted her symptoms. He controlled her daily routine. This level of involvement, they argued, was not support. It was surveillance. Witnesses testified that Stacey's access to others diminished as her illness worsened. Friends who attempted to visit were often told she was too weak or resting. Phone conversations became shorter. Over time, her world narrowed to the space Matt allowed her to occupy. The defense countered that such behavior was normal for a spouse caring for a seriously ill partner. But the prosecution asked the jury to consider the totality of the circumstances. Not just what Matt did, but when he did it. Not just how he acted, but what he knew. They returned again to the digital evidence. Search histories were displayed, showing repeated inquiries into poisons and symptoms that mirrored Stacey's condition. The jury was reminded that these searches occurred before Stacey's death, not after. This was not hindsight. This was foresight. The affair was revisited, not as a moral failure, but as evidence of motive. Prosecutors argued that Matt Baker was desperate to preserve his public image. Divorce would have exposed his infidelity and shattered his authority within the church. Widowhood, however, allowed him to emerge as a victim rather than a perpetrator. They described this as the final piece of the puzzle. Motive means opportunity. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom grew heavy with anticipation. The jury had listened for days to testimony that stripped away the layers of a carefully constructed life. Now they were asked to decide whether the man before them was a victim of circumstance or the architect of suffering. In his closing statement, the prosecutor spoke directly about Stacey Baker, not as evidence, not as a case, but as a person, a woman who trusted, a mother who loved, a wife who believed in the vows she made. The jury was reminded that Stacey never had the chance to defend herself. She never knew why her body was failing her. She never realized the danger came from the person closest to her. The defense urged the jury to resist emotion and focus solely on proof. They warned against condemning a man based on character judgments or public outrage. They asked for reasonable doubt. Then the case was handed to the jury. Deliberations were careful and deliberate. Jurors revisited testimony, examined evidence, and weighed explanations. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was unmistakable. The verdict was read. Matt Baker was found guilty of murder. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden collapse, just the quiet finality of accountability. The man who once preached morality now stood convicted of one of the most calculated crimes imaginable. During sentencing, the court acknowledged the prolonged nature of Stacey Baker's suffering. This was not a momentary act, but a sustained betrayal carried out over time. Matt Baker was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to manipulate trust or authority. As he was led away, the image he had relied on for so long finally dissolved. For Stacey Baker's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never restore what was taken. Her children would grow up without their mother. Her voice would remain absent, but her truth was no longer hidden. The trial had exposed a painful reality. That trust can be weaponized. That respectability can conceal cruelty. And that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we least expect. If this case has impacted you, take a moment to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss another deep investigation here on Dark Psyche Case Files, where we uncover the truths that hide behind carefully crafted appearances. After the verdict was delivered and the courtroom slowly emptied, the case of Matt Baker did not simply fade into legal history. Instead, it lingered in conversations, in communities of faith, and in the minds of those who had once trusted him. The conviction marked the end of a trial, but it did not mark the end of the story. For many, it was only the beginning of a deeper reckoning. In Waco, Texas, the impact was profound. Churches reflected quietly on how easily authority can shield cruelty. Congregations questioned how a man entrusted with spiritual leadership could harbor such deception. Parents reconsidered the meaning of trust. The case became a cautionary tale whispered among communities that once believed moral character could be inferred from titles alone. For Stacey Baker's family, life moved forward in a way it never should have had to. Grief did not end with justice. It merely changed shape. Each milestone her children reached came with an absence that could not be filled. Holidays arrived with reminders of what had been taken. While the legal system had spoken, emotional closure remained elusive. Stacey's story began to resonate beyond her immediate circle because it reflected a pattern many recognized but few wanted to confront. Her suffering was not loud. It was not dramatic. It unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, masked by explanations that sounded reasonable enough to discourage scrutiny. That subtlety made it dangerous. Experts who later analyzed the case noted how power dynamics played a central role. Matt Baker held multiple forms of authority, professional, religious, and domestic. Each reinforced the other. As a dentist, he was perceived as educated and knowledgeable. As a pastor, he was seen as morally grounded. As a husband, he was presumed protective. Together, these roles created a shield that deflected suspicion. Stacey trusted that shield. So did everyone else. The case forced a difficult conversation about how abuse does not always present as aggression. Sometimes it appears as care. Sometimes it hides behind attentiveness. Sometimes it disguises itself as concern. Stacey's decline was explained away as illness, while the true cause remained unspoken and unseen. In the years that followed, the case was studied by professionals seeking to understand how long-term poisoning can evade detection. It became a reference point in discussions about coercive control and intimate partner abuse. Stacey's experience illustrated how manipulation can isolate victims not through force, but through dependency and confusion. Her voice, once doubted even by herself, gained clarity in hindsight. People who had known Stacey recalled moments that now felt painfully significant. Her quiet fear, her uncertainty, her attempts to articulate that something was wrong even when she lacked proof. These recollections became reminders of how easily intuition can be dismissed, especially when contradicted by someone who appears credible. Matt Baker's fall from grace also sparked broader reflection within faith communities. Leaders spoke about the danger of elevating individuals beyond accountability. The case served as a reminder that spiritual authority does not equate to moral immunity. In fact, it can sometimes be used as camouflage. For the public, the story of Matt and Stacey Baker became emblematic of a deeper truth. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it operates patiently, calculating outcomes while maintaining appearances. Sometimes it relies on trust rather than fear. And sometimes it lives within the home. As time passed, Stacey's name became associated not only with tragedy, but with awareness. Her story encouraged conversations about listening more carefully, questioning assumptions, and recognizing that harm can exist even in places that feel safe. Justice in this case did not come quickly, but when it came, it arrived with clarity. Matt Baker would spend the rest of his life in prison, stripped of the authority he once wielded. The image he had constructed collapsed completely, replaced by a truth he could no longer control. Stacey Baker, though gone, was no longer silent. Her story endured, not as a mystery, but as a warning. In the years that followed Matt Baker's conviction, the echoes of the case continued to surface in places far beyond the courtroom. It became a reference point in discussions about trust, power, and the hidden nature of abuse. For those who studied the case closely, it was not only about what happened to Stacey Baker, but about how easily her suffering was overlooked while it was happening. Stacey's life, when viewed beyond the tragedy of her death, told a story of quiet resilience. She was a mother who prioritized her children, a woman who believed in kindness, and a person who tried to hold her family together even as her health deteriorated. She did not seek attention. She did not dramatize her pain. That restraint, while rooted in humility and faith, ultimately made it easier for her suffering to be misunderstood. Those who later reflected on their interactions with Stacey often spoke of regret. Regret for not asking more questions. Regret for accepting convenient explanations. Regret for assuming that a respected man could not also be capable of harm. These reflections were not about assigning blame, but about recognizing how collective silence can allow abuse to persist. The case also reshaped how professionals approached similar situations. Medical experts emphasized the importance of listening directly to patients, even when caregivers appear attentive and informed. Investigators pointed to the value of examining patterns rather than isolated incidents. Advocates highlighted how coercive control can exist without visible violence, operating through dependency, confusion, and isolation. Stacey Baker's death forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths: that faith communities are not immune to manipulation, that professional credentials do not guarantee integrity, and that appearances, no matter how convincing, should never replace accountability. For Matt Baker, prison became a place where the influence he once held no longer existed. The authority he relied on to command trust was stripped away. There were no congregations to lead, no patients to reassure, no image to maintain. What remained was the weight of his actions and the permanence of his sentence. Life imprisonment was not just a legal outcome, it was a symbolic reversal. The man who once controlled every aspect of his wife's life now lived under constant control himself. The secrecy he depended on was replaced by exposure. The patience he used to harm became the time he would spend confined. For Stacey's children, the future unfolded with challenges that no sentence could erase. Growing up without their mother meant navigating life with unanswered questions and lasting loss. Yet they also grew up knowing the truth, knowing that their mother's suffering was not invisible, knowing that justice, though imperfect, was pursued. Public awareness of the case ensured that Stacey Baker would not be remembered solely as a victim. She became a symbol of why listening matters, why skepticism can be protective, why trust must be balanced with vigilance. The story also served as a reminder to viewers and listeners of true crime narratives that behind every case are real lives, not just headlines. Stacey was not a plot point. She was a person whose final months were filled with confusion and fear, whose trust was betrayed in the most intimate way possible. As time passed, the case continued to circulate in documentaries, discussions, and educational settings. Each retelling carried a responsibility, not to sensationalize but to illuminate, not to exploit tragedy but to honor truth. And that is where stories like this find their purpose. They remind us that evil does not always appear chaotic or obvious. It can be orderly. It can be patient. It can hide behind kindness and credibility. The danger lies not just in the act itself, but in how easily it is excused when wrapped in familiarity. Stacey Baker's legacy is not defined by how she died, but by what her story revealed. It revealed the cost of unchecked authority. It revealed the fragility of trust, and it revealed the importance of paying attention, even when doing so is uncomfortable. If this story has made you reflect, if it has challenged assumptions or encouraged awareness, take a moment to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button so you can continue exploring these complex truths here on Dark Psyche Case Files. Because understanding the darkness is one way we learn to protect the light.